I'm
Hello.
Ann Searink. I work with Foster Swift. Been representing public municipalities and libraries for about 30 years now and have drafted hundreds of ballot proposals. And we're right now we're kind of like really knee deep into ballot season for the August 2026 ballot. So this is all this stuff is fresh on my mind. So one of the first questions you have to ask yourself is what authority do you have to request or levy a millage? And for libraries, it comes down to a couple things, and pretty much you have to know what type of library that you are. Um, if you don't know what type of library that you are, seek Claire's help because Claire has the institutional knowledge and the access to the deep depths of the Library of Michigan. Sometimes we have to go back, and Claire has assisted, I know, in going back 100 or more years and trying to figure out how a library was established. But it's really important that you know how you're established because that will dictate what authority you have to levy a millage and how much you can levy and all of that. So most libraries, I think on this, as I just kind of breezed over it, but a lot of libraries are district libraries, and district libraries have specific authority to levy a tax. Um, Levy a tax for a district library can mean two things. One, the district library itself can levy a district-wide tax. And that means that you levy the tax throughout your entire district. It's levied uniformly, meaning that if you have two townships in your district, one of them is not going to be levied at a different rate than the other one. Um, the district library has the capacity to levy up to 4 mills. And this is one of the reasons that there's a number of reasons we're not going to talk about establishment or why you should be a district library, but one of the reasons that a lot of communities want to become a district library is that you are allowed to go up to 4 mills. As we'll see with PA 164 libraries, you're capped at 2 mills. There's some communities that are PA 164 libraries that are maxed out at their 2 mills. They need more money, but can't get it through a millage in this way because of their statutory cap. Of those 4 mills, two can be in perpetuity, and then two can be levied for not more than 20 years. Um, so I've had clients that have, because of the perpetuity, which is actually a very rare thing these days as far as millages go. Um, there's libraries that can levy it in perpetuity. District libraries are one. Most communities now, after some constitutional amendments, are capped at 20 years. But because the District Library Establishment Act predated those constitutional amendments, you're still allowed to levy the statutory 4 mills, and two of them can be in perpetuity. Um, I want to pause a bit because a district library can also levy it can also be funded in a different way, meaning that the individual participating municipalities within your district can levy a millage to support the library. And I know that there's some libraries that started that way, that they had, let's take Township A and Township B. Instead of being a district-wide millage, Township A had a millage and Township B had a millage. But this is, for those of you that are still with those funding mechanisms, it can be very stressful to get those communities to put it on the ballot. They have the authority, unless there's a contract in place that says otherwise, they have authority to determine the amount and the timing and all of that of the millage. That's why the district libraries authority-wide millage is so important because the district library board has exclusive authority on its own to levy this millage. You don't have to get participating municipalities to approve. All you need is a resolution from your library board that has the right ballot language in it, submitted to the right people, within the statutory time, and it goes on the ballot. You don't need permission from other entities. And so I think that's a big advantage for district libraries that go for the authority-wide millage. That's not true necessarily if you're a district library that has an individual municipality, like a city maybe, that levies its millage in support of your library. Um, as I mentioned before, you have to levy this millage within the district at its same rate. we've seen some issues come up with, for example, if you have a district library and you have a participating municipality that's added later, make sure that you're levying at the same rate regardless of when that municipality was added, because again, the district library is a constitutional requirement that you levy the same rate within your jurisdiction uniformly. Again, and I mentioned before that the district library board is the exclusive determining body to determine when the millage goes on, how much, if you want a renewal, if you want new millage, again, it's a lot of authority for a district library. I think the next most common library with independent authority is Section 10 or 10A PA 164 libraries. So these are township, village, or city libraries. For townships and villages, you are a PA 164 10 library. If you're a city library, I'm going to put a little bookmark in you because you could have different authority depending on what type of city library you are. So what we're talking about now is if you are established under 10 or 10A of PA 164, meaning you had to have a petition, you have an elected board. And so if this is the type of entity you are, you can have a tax of up to 2 mills. And again, it can be levied in perpetuity or for a specific number of years. Your millage, though, unlike a district library, as I mentioned before, a district library is the entity that has the authority to levy the tax. PA 164, Section 10 and 10A are a little bit odd animals. So I would really get your lawyer involved in this, because you as a tax Section 10 or 10A city, village, or township library have the exclusive authority under Section 10C of PA 164 to ask for a new millage or a renewal of millage once you are formed. There's a petition process to form you, but once you are formed, that is exclusively within the jurisdiction of the library board. Now, what's a little different from a district library is that your ballot language, instead of saying, shall the library levy the tax, it'll say, shall the township or the city levy the tax? But again, it will be on behalf and for the library. So you want to make sure that the ballot language is correct in naming your library and making sure that the money goes towards you. Again, there's a little bit of a PA 164, and I know Claire, if you want to ever jump in and talk about the problems with PA 164, but the problem is it's an 1877 statute that hasn't been updated much, and it's got a little bit of gray area. And one of the gray areas is really the process for putting it on the ballot. Now, I have my own opinion. My own opinion is that the library board adopts the resolution to place it on the ballot. And then what the statute says is that the city, village, or township shall put it on the ballot. Now, some of you live in communities where your city, township, or village rubber stamps it. They're confused. The county clerk may be confused. This is something that if you are this type of library, I would make sure you know the process that you're going to follow in your particular community ahead of time, so that there's no questions that arise after the ballot language has been submitted, and then certainly after the ballot deadline has passed. So again, this is the process, the resolution, and how you put it on the ballot, something you should specifically talk to your individual attorney about. Section 1 city libraries, these are the most, I think, the most interesting of the city libraries. Is because a city, okay, the difference between a city library under Section 1 and a city library under Section 10A is that the library board really loses its ability to determine the tax, okay? If you're a Section 1 city library, the city council or commission can levy up to 1 mill without a vote of the people. And again, I'm going to put a little asterisk here, because always look at your city charter. Your city charter might have extra or different things that you want to make sure that you follow. But so just following what PA 164 says, you can levy up to 1 mill without a vote. This is so unusual. There are very few millages in the state of Michigan that allow you just to, by resolution or by action of a board, to put it on the ballot without a vote. The second mill, you can levy up to 2 mills. The second mill does have to be by a vote of the people. But again, this is where it's not really within the discretion of the library board. The city council makes the decision on this. So, Claire, I saw you took yourself off mute. Do you have that?
We have one question.
Okay.
Um, so the question is, we have two townships within our district. What would happen if one township doesn't pass and the other does, if they're a
Oh,
district library?
very good question. And I meant to mention this, so thank you. It depends on what type of millage. If you are a district library levying a district millage, it just has to pass district-wide. So as long as at the end of the day, the total between the two townships, if you have two townships that are PA 164 libraries, um, or I'm sorry, if you have two townships in your district, so Township A and Township B are your participating municipalities, they're in your district, and it passes district-wide, you can levy it in your district, even if the voters in one of the townships didn't pass it. Now, that's not true if you have your funding mechanism is through an individual participating municipality. Like, for example, Township A can put, let's say Township A levies a millage to support the district library, and Township B levies a millage to support the district library. If it doesn't pass in Township B, then Township B can't levy it in support of the district. That's why I think a lot of, you know, having a district-wide millage is important. It's more stable funding for you. It's in your control, and you have the advantage that if it doesn't pass within one jurisdiction, but it passes within your district as a whole, you can levy it.
Okay, we had one other question. I see that Rosie raised her hand. Rosie, I'm going to go ahead and let you ask your question, but verbal questions, you have some feedback there, Rosie. Looks like she is not off.
Okay, I can wait till the end.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. All right. Thanks, Claire. I can't see the chat, so I appreciate you.
You are all good.
Um, so So we're back to section 1, city libraries, levy up to 1 mil without a vote, ask for a second mill if the voters increase. And again, it's not up to the discretion of the library board. This is one of the reasons why some section 1 city libraries end up going to become section 10A city libraries is because of this, the authority with respect to the millage. County, I'm going to briefly touch on counties. I don't know if there's any county people out there. Again, the county is not as old. I think it's like 1919, Claire, 19. It's in the 19 teens, so it's not as old as PA 164, but it's definitely shorter, which it's hard to believe. And really, again, the county libraries are very similar to PA 164 Section 1 libraries, in that the county board of commissioners is the one that puts the ballot proposal on the ballot. The library board typically makes a recommendation. We recommend that you have a resolution asking the county board of commissioners to put the ballot proposal on, and drafting the ballot proposal for them to approve, but that the ultimate authority is with the county on that. There are other types of libraries. There's charter city libraries and there's special act libraries. If you're not within one of these groups, this is something that I think you need to seek specific attorney review of your particular formation and enabling legislation, because you really have to go, into the charter and into the, your special act to determine what type of authority you have. So if you don't see yourself in one of these categories, reach out to your attorney or reach out to Claire to figure out where you are, and then go from there. So one of the questions that you ask are how much, and I suspect this is really one of the topics that's been covered in your other presentations. But again, taking into account a lot of things, and libraries are, and I watch libraries and I watch municipalities struggle. And it's, as a taxpayer, it is very heartening to see how much thought is put into this question by a lot of municipalities, because it's not the sky's the limit. How much do you think we can, ask voters before they'll say no? It's really like, how much do we need? How much, what services do we want to provide? Are we lacking in services now? How much do we want? How much do we need? Um, you know, often you'll be kind of going along nicely, and all of a sudden you might get very lucky and have a large endowment or bequest, and all of a sudden you don't need as much millage money anymore. These are the types of things that any library needs to take into account. But the other thing that you should take into account too is Headley rollbacks, and the effect that the Headley rollback may have on your community. And that's something that you could talk with your either county equalization department about, maybe, or your treasurer's office about, to see kind of what historically your rollbacks have been and how much that has affected the amount of revenue that you are collecting. Because certainly if you have a 3 or 4 year millage, it's not going to affect you in the way that it's going to affect you maybe with a 20-year millage. It's hard to kind of anticipate 15, 16 years down the road where that revenue may be. But all of that combined gets you into the discussion about how much, because and then other factors that have included this, because I have a lot of clients that ask me a lot of questions like, what do you think? How much should we ask for? And do you think we should go in August or November? And um, it's really hard. It's hard to tell as the lawyer. I'm not living in the community. But these are the questions you need to ask yourself is, are voters approving other millages? Like in your community, does every millage pass by a mile? Or are you seeing, certain millages that rarely pass, that people will pay for fire service, but they won't pay for roads? Like people are picking and choosing what services that they'll pay for. Your last ballot proposal, maybe it was 20 years ago and it's not going to be relevant. Maybe it was 5 years ago, but if it was 5 years ago and it passed by 90%, you might not be as concerned about like the specifics of, are you asking for 0.75 or 0.73 mils, for example, if it passes overwhelming in your community? Again, Headley rollbacks. The other thing that you really need to look at is the long-term plans for the funds, because most of the time we're talking about operating millages here. We're talking about, a district library will levy 1 mil for 15 years for every operating purpose. You've got your building. One of the trends that I've seen is that, and Claire, you are the institutional knowledge of this, so if I'm getting this incorrectly, but I see most operational millages anecdotally when we get the list from the Library of Michigan and they keep track, most of them pass, I would say. The ones that struggle are the voted bonds. Those are the ones that I see not always having such a clear path forward. And so what some libraries are doing now is deciding to plan for and pay for capital improvements through a voted millage instead of a voted bond. Okay. And so what I mean by that is, let's take a district library that has, I said 4 mils, 2 mils in perpetuity. If you have a financing mechanism that you've issued bonds and you need a certain amount of money to pay back those bonds over 30 years, some communities are opting for what I would say a regular millage instead of going for the full faith and credit bond proposal. This is a little outside the scope of this particular thing, but the point is that if that's part of your purpose of, you might not be able to just do it for 5 years. If you've got financial obligations that require a certain amount of income for 30 years, you're going to have to go for a 30-year millage. You're going to have to make that millage enough to be able to cover the debt obligation or the payments of those bonds. So really, a lot of it depends on what you're using it for. The other factor that we need to talk about here, especially if you're doing a major capital improvement, is you might need more operational money. And a lot of libraries are so focused on, well, what's it cost to do the brick and mortar, to pay the architect, to, buy the materials, to construct the building, that, you really have to keep in mind of if you're going from a 5,000 square foot building to a 10,000 square foot building, how much more operational costs, furniture, all of that stuff is going to go into how much you ask for. So, most libraries that I work with are like on the ball with that. Like you guys have really thought it out. You planned it. You've got all the legwork done, and it's just a matter of checking the boxes to make sure that you have all that information. But that's just an important part of, how much do you ask for? Make sure it's enough, because you don't want to go back next year or 2 years from now and have to ask for a supplemental millage because you way underestimated what you would need from the beginning. So that's the kind of thing that we need to talk about with your board and with your community. So the heart of this presentation is going to be developing the ballot language. And there are some very specific there's some very specific information in your ballot proposal that has to be in there. Public Act 248 of 1999 really set forth these requirements. We're going to go through them. I will say at the onset, I get a lot of questions about explanations in the ballot proposal. Okay. There's clients that want to do a lot of explaining to voters issues within the ballot language itself. I'm just going to speak in generalities here because every community is different. Every ballot proposal is different. I generally think you really need to talk to your lawyer about adding extra information to your ballot proposal, because ballot proposals are subject to court action if they're found to be, people can try to strike them down for different reasons or another. And so we want to make sure that your ballot proposal is as technically and legally correct. And anytime you add extra stuff to that, it increases the chance that you're going to be challenged on that. The best way to really handle the information. And the other thing, like I put myself in the voter's position. Okay. And I go into the ballot and I look at the ballot, and you want to be educating voters ahead of time that you don't want them to be reading your ballot proposal and this is the first time they may have heard of a controversial issue or something that needs a lot of explanation. And so I think that, and I'm struggling to give you a very good example. I don't know that I want to give you a good example, but I do get clients that say, well, can I explain, for example, that this is not a new millage, it's a replacement of a millage, I will give this example because this is kind of a most frequent that comes up. Let's say that you have a district library that was funded previously by one municipality. They provided all the funding. The other municipalities, contributed a little bit, but there's one municipality, that a city, for example, that had a millage. Well, you've decided, that you want to go for an authority-wide millage, and that the district library is going to now put a ballot proposal on. This is the first time your district library has placed a proposal on the ballot. You've never had a, district library millage. It's always been a participating municipality. Technically, that's a new millage. Even if it's in the same amount as the city was providing you, it's a new millage because it's the first time the district library has asked for that millage. The natural reaction for that district library is to say, well, I want voters to understand that if they're going to pay a 1 mil district library millage, they've been paying a 1 mil city millage. The city voters, it's not going to change them. Yes, that may be true. That's a great time to do that, is with either have your vote yes committee, which we'll get to, or have an informational brochure from the, I don't really think that the right place to explain all that is in your ballot proposal. Okay. So, but that is something that is between you and your attorney and your board and kind of what risks you want to take. But I'll just tell you, that's my general recommendation. Ballot language, if you've read it, you guys are all voters, you go in there, it's very dry, it's very matter of fact. It has to have certain requirements in it. We want to make sure all those in there, but it's not like 2 paragraphs long where people are reading a treatise in the voting booth about what they're voting on. So just to keep that in mind when we're going talking about ballot language, I generally like to keep it as simple as possible within the ballot proposal, and then use other avenues to market the proposal and to provide that information to your voters. So the first one is the millage rate to be authorized, and we do that in the number of mills. And so every ballot will typically say, I want 1 mill, and then you describe that that's $1 per $1,000 of taxable value. Make sure that your written description matches your numbers. One of the common, I think, mistakes is to kind of use your old ballot proposal maybe and not be very careful about using your old ballot proposal. It may be out of date by now. We've kind of tweaked our format over the years on the ones that we do in our firm. But you want to make sure that if you asked for 1 mill last time and are asking for 1.5, that you change the 1.5 and then say it's $1.50 instead of $1. You don't want to have inconsistent messages. And then we use we'll usually use the language in an amount not to exceed. And I've never seen a court case on this. I'd be hard pressed to find a court case on this, but the old ballot proposals say shall the library levy 1 mill, for example. And so now we say shall the library levy an amount not to exceed 1 mill, because there are libraries that did it last year that I know of that don't levy your maximum authorized millage because, again, you may have a fund balance that is high and you don't want to keep going back to voters. There could be a number of reasons why you're not levying your maximum. And we want to make sure that the ballot language is set up so that, I believe that the library would have discretion either way, but you really want to make sure that you have that in your ballot proposal up to 1 mill to make sure that you have the discretion to determine each year how much you want to levy. Estimated revenue, the amount collected in the first year. This is the work. I'm going to say I struggle with the August ballots. Struggle. Because you have to estimate what it will be in the first year of levy. And this is the problem with August ballots, is that the ballot deadline is May 12th this year. You may or may not have your 2026 taxable values given to you by county equalization by that time. You may get them on May 11th, and you can't change them. Okay. And the same, we'll talk about that a little bit with the rollback, the renewal issue. We have to do the best we can with the information. And the statute basically says we have to provide an estimate. So we typically we know we have the 2025 taxable value. So if your community, we'll sometimes take the rate of inflation, like 2.8%, multiply whatever it raised in 2025 by 2.8% to estimate what it would be in 2026. Your equalization department may have a better rate for you. They might have more information about what the Headley rollbacks would be. All of this could come into it, but it's important to understand it's an estimated amount of revenue. I think the trouble that you can get into, look, for example, if you estimate it, I've had clients that panic because they've estimated it at 100,000. Libraries like to be very specific. And after the ballot's already approved, after the deadline's gone, they find out it's going to be 102,000. That's way within the ballpark of the estimate. It's just an estimate where you may get into trouble. And I will tell you, and if Claire can confirm, I've never seen a court case where someone's challenged the estimated amount and challenged validity based on the estimated amount. Where I could see an issue is that if you tell voters, for example, that it will raise 100,000 and it actually raises 300,000, I think that's where you could get yourself into some trouble. Other than that, I think that having a reasonable basis and a good estimate is really all you can do, because you're never going to know the exact amount of that. The next thing that you have to put is the duration of the millage. And this is, and I put here what we do. We usually do for a period of 20 through, and I like to use the word, 2026 through 2045 inclusive. Here, we want to make sure that the dates match the years. And this is where you could get into a problem, because I've seen some of them where you want to say, oh, 20 years, that should be 2026 to 2046. No, that's actually a 21-year millage because you count the first year and the second year. When I'm doing the ballot proposal and I go, you talk about people going back to the kindergarten basics. Okay, I still go 2026, 2027, 20, just to make sure, especially if it's an odd year millage, like a 6 or 8 year millage, it's a little harder to kind of see that. 5-year millages, but the dates should look a little strange here, but that's actually a 20-year millage. Um, again, we use 20 years because that's sometimes the maximum. District libraries, NPA 164, Section 10 and 10A libraries can levy millages in perpetuity. If it's in perpetuity, we say it's levied in perpetuity beginning with whatever the specific date of the first year of the levy. The ballot also has to have the first year of the levy. This is something you want to make sure. If it's a renewal of the millage, you want to make sure that the ballot, there's no gap between the end of the last year and the start of the new year. So dig out your old ballot language. There's a couple reasons why you want to review it before you enter into your new millage, but wanting to make sure that that is a continuation if it's a part of a renewal. I use the word levy, and I want to make sure that everyone's very clear on that because millages are levied either in the summer on the tax bill or in the December tax bill. So let's just take one that's levied in December. Goes December 1, tax bills go out. That's the date of the levy, the year that the tax is levied. Now that the funds are going to come in the next year, and so it can get confusing because you might think of revenue stream rather than levy. You might say, oh, the millage, if I ask for a new millage, the money's going to come in 2027, used for a 2027 budget. That's the first year of levy. It's not. If you want money to come in 2027, it needs to be levied on December 1 of 2026, and that's when the tax bills start getting paid, and then it's collected up until the deadline, which is like usually mid-February of the next year. So again, if it's a renewal, make sure that you are understanding what year your last levy, your last millage ends, and make sure it's continuous. If it's a new millage, you want to make sure that you're starting in the correct year. Now, district libraries have to levy a millage, as I mentioned, uniformly in the district. So you have to be really careful if you are a district. Districts with 2 townships are generally pretty easy. They have December levies. You just have to worry about the December levy. There are some district libraries that have cities that only levy in the summer. And because of that, you have to be very, very careful on what the timing of your election is because you have to levy uniformly in the district in the same year. That means that July levy and the December levy have to be the same amount. So keep that in mind if you are a district library or if you're a township or a city library that levies in the summer, make sure you have that deadline in mind and when that goes on the thing or on the tax bill because that's the date of the levy, the first year of the levy of the tax. So again, giving this example, if the last year of the renewal was 2025, you want to make sure, and you want a 10-year millage, that the next year, the first year of the levy should be 2026. You may decide that it's not. Maybe you have so much money that you want to, wait and not levy it. You want to take 1 year off to get your fund balance down and start again the next year. It's important for a couple of reasons. One, you have to know the first year levy. 2, we'll get to this. If you want to call it a renewal, you can't let the authorization lapse a year and still call it a renewal the following year. So again, one of the facts that you have to keep in mind. And I want to take a pause a minute here because the first year of the levy goes hand in hand with the deadlines too. And the question always arises, well, what year can I levy it? In Michigan, and make sure your lawyer agrees with this, but most of the, you certify your L-4029s before September 30 every year. And then you think, well, I already put in my tax for, the December one can't, the November ballot can't then be levied in December. In most cases, it can. And you have to submit your, the November results are submitted to county equalization. They redo the L-4029, they redo the tax bills, they're levied on December 1. I always recommend that especially if you're going in November, that you confirm with your local unit that there'll be no roadblocks to you putting that on the December tax bill. So it's just one of those pause. I feel very comfortable with the legal issues, and I feel very comfortable, for example, that in like if I tell library A, my client, okay, library, I looked at the statute, I looked at if you put this on in November, you can put it on the December tax bill, no problem. That's all fine and well, unless you have county equalization or a new county treasurer who disagrees, and then all of a sudden it's November 15th and you're in a big discussion with the county officials about whether they're going to put your tax on the bill. That's not the time to have that conversation. The time is, okay, this isn't, we're preparing for a November ballot. It's due mid-August. In July, hey, let's call the county clerk, let's call county equalization, let's confirm the deadline for the ballot. Hey, county treasurers, county equalization, if this, we're confirming that if this is passed in November, that it will go on the ballot in December, or the tax levy for our library in December, just to make sure that everyone's on the same page. Again, anecdotally, you just don't want to be having these arguments, down to the wire. You want to have them everything should be before your ballot language, the final date before your ballot language. All this stuff should be worked out.
And we have another question
Yeah.
in the chat. So the question is, just to make sure I understand, we're a district library with a 10-year millage. It was last on the ballot in 2018. That means we'll be on the ballot again in 2027, correct?
That's one of the, I don't mean to sound lawyerly, but I don't know. You'd have to look a couple things. One is when you're on the ballot is a strategic decision for the library. Okay, because some libraries wait until the millage is expired to go on the ballot. Some of them go on the ballot in their last year of levy. There's issues about Headley rollbacks and all of that. So I don't know the specific answer to your question. I think the more important answer, or the more important thing to figure out, is when is the last year that you can levy your millage? When is the last year that millage is going to go on your tax bills? And when is the first year that you're not going to have any renewed funding right now? And then when you answer that question, then that'll start the discussion on when the appropriate time to go on the ballot is. Claire, are you okay? I must want to make sure I got that right. All right. But I dig out that millage proposal and figure out when that is sooner than later. Libraries are great. I just want to say, I know we're being recorded, so I want to be careful of what I say, but libraries will literally ask me like 3 years in advance, like when do they need to start like planning. There's other communities that will call me like 2 days before the ballot deadline and say, we need to renew. So libraries are planners, and I appreciate that. So I think, at least understanding when the last year of your tax levy are. Do not rely on your L-4029. The L-4029 will say the last year of the levy. It has been wrong. And if at least a couple times that I've been seen, and that's enough too many times for me to feel comfortable relying. It's a good like way to kind of make sure. And if it's wrong on the L-4029s, I'd make sure it's corrected. Because sometimes they'll say like the last year of levy. I saw one recently that was like it said the last year authorized. I can't remember exactly what the thing is, and it said June 30th, like 2026. And I was like, oh, that's weird. But what it meant was is that July 1, there's no money coming in. That like that when I saw like the 2026, you'd think, okay, well, you can levy it in 2026, but the way the L4029 was written, it was a little bit, it's actually not, they claim that your ballot, it ended that year, and so that the July 1 wouldn't be the renewed date. So all of this is just really important to make sure that you understand exactly when your funding ends. That's
So, Anne, we have a request for you to repeat those two questions that you answered the prior question with. When was the last time you, when's the last time you can levy your millage? And for the question, the 10-year millage, when she asked, she was on the ballot in 2018, means you'll be on the ballot in
oh
2027. You said there's two questions to ask. One is, when is the last time you can levy your millage?
Oh, and this, I meant, then the second question is then when should you put the ballot? When should you go on? When you know that, the next question is what election should you choose then to renew that? Some libraries routinely wait till the year after it's already expired. A lot of libraries don't want to wait that long to put it on the ballot. So that's the second question. Is that clear? Am I okay? Yes, thank you. My train of thought sometimes, like, if I'm doing bullet points or 1 and 2, I don't fill up with the 2. So thanks, appreciate that. Okay. Um, moving on then, a clear statement of the purpose of the millage. So the statute, the bullet points that are in bold here are the ones that are part of that are the specific provisions of the law, which is MCL 211.24F. The purpose is very important. Now, for most operational or other types of general millages, we say, for example, for any and all district library purpose authorized by law. That's the kitchen sink. Like there's nothing that you cannot use it for. You said it's for anything that's authorized by law for district libraries. But why it's important is that Michigan law says that funds raised from millage may not be used for purposes other than those specifically set forth in the ballot language. Okay. And I'm going to get into some like examples in a minute. But if you want it to be used for everything, make sure it's used for everything. And don't necessarily just regurgitate the language you had last time. It may work, it may be fine. And I think some of the millages have been, I want to say corrected over the years. But when I first started doing this, there's a lot of millages that were drafted in the 1990s that said for operations. Okay. And what they meant was for all district library purposes authorized by law. But it begs the question when you say operation, whether you can use it for capital improvements. You don't want to beg the question. You don't want to have the question. So that's why, and when we talk about renewal and the purpose, I'll get into that in a minute. But you want to make sure that especially if you're doing a brand new millage and everything's up for grabs, make sure it's as encompassing as you want. Libraries don't have as much. I don't see this as much as I see in other municipalities. For example, and this is not library related; it's millage related. There's a millage they'll say for fire service or to buy fire equipment. Well, can you use that for then ambulance service? The question is whether the language is broad enough to do that. Like, again, you don't want to be having those conversations. So make sure that your language includes as broad as you can. So, and I'm going to get into some specifics library related so you can see. So an example of a common problem, we want to use the money to operate a new building, but our ballot language only says that the money can be used for construction of a new library. Can we use the money for the operations? Here, that would likely be subject to challenge. What happens with money that you collect is that it's held in escrow until you can use it for a purpose that's stated in the millage language. Again, be proactive, especially if if you have a brand new millage where there's no like any limitations on what the purpose is, constructing, equiparating, and operating instead of just saying, constructing. There are specific reasons why, and I'll get to the next one too. And the next example has sort of a similar problem. 2 years ago, the voters approved a millage for 10 years to operate the John Doe branch of the Newtown District Library. We're now considering closing that branch. Can we use the millage funds for another purpose? Again, it may be subject to challenge. So, but this is sometimes a strategic decision because I have drafted ballot proposals where the specific intent is only to use it for a purpose. And they're selling it to voters is that, look, we want to build you a new building. This is only going to be used for the building. We're not going to use it to hire new people. We're not going to use it to, buy furniture. We're not going to use it to buy, online media, nothing. It's just for the construction. Again, there's nothing wrong with that. The legal issue is pretty clear. You have to have the purpose of the millage, right? But the practical implications are where it really becomes important. What are you going to use the millage for? I worry a lot more about 20-year millages than I do about 2-year millages. I worry a lot more if I think the client has used a word like operating and hasn't really considered all of it. I don't worry as much as when the client says, look, our board voted. We want voters to understand that if they approve this millage, this is exactly where the money's going to. It's very limited, and that's our specific intent. And that's fine. That's a decision that's clearly within the scope of the library board. That's fine. I may encourage them to consider being a little bit more expansive, and that's just a decision between you and your library board and the attorney on how that would work. Another problem is that, again, a common example, we just asked voters for an operating millage last year, but the money's not going to be enough, and we have to reduce the hours the library is open. Can we ask for an additional millage to increase the hours of operation? Again, yes, same issue. But you got to keep track and escrow that millage for that purpose only, and make sure that you're spending it, because you don't want to then have a problem with unauthorized expenditure of funds. So you want to be really clear about that issue. So the purpose of it. Sometimes with clients, like I typically, I'll ask the client what the purpose will be, and they'll give me something general, and then I'll propose what I think would be a good example of millage language. Sometimes for some millages, we're doing things like saying for all district library purposes authorized by law, including but not limited, and making some very specific mentions in the language. Again, there's nothing wrong with that. It runs that line, I think, between, using your ballot to explain what you're going to do versus, using your marketing material to do that. But again, it may be very, it may be very dependent on your community. For example, you may have people that are very upset with the library because you reduced Friday hours. And it might be very important to you and to pass in the ballot that you tell voters if that one of the purposes will be increasing the hours. But you got to live up to all of that. You got to live up to what you're told the voters. You got to live up to what's in your marketing material. So again, you want to be very careful about that. Ballot language, renewal or new millage. This is the one that I still get a lot of questions, concerns, a lot of hand wringing, because there's a lot of communities, and I'm not going to say libraries, I'm just going to say millages. I'm not going to pick on any sort of entity. There's a lot of people doing this wrong. Okay. They're doing it wrong. It's wrong on the ballot. Millages don't get challenged that much. Okay. Which is good. It's not a bad thing. But because of that, I will get, well, my neighbor X community did the same thing and it passed and there's nothing the matter with it. That all might be well and true, but again, I'm going to tell you what the statute says and what the statute is and what the law is. In my opinion, you should definitely consult with your own attorney on this issue. I know that there's differences of opinion with different lawyers. Obviously, there's different ballot proposals on there. So this is one of those things. I'm going to tell you what I think here, but definitely review this issue with your own lawyer, and all of this with your own lawyer, but especially this issue. So it has to have a clear statement indicating whether a proposed millage is a renewal of a previously authorized millage or the authorization of a new additional millage. Okay, two things here where I get a lot of pushback from clients. Rightly so. I mean, pushback is always good. It leads to always a very good conversation. The issue is what is a renewal and why do I have to use the words new additional? Can't I just say increase? The reason here is that this italicized is what the statute says. It says it gives you two choices. You call it a renewal or you call it new additional. So this is why we do what we do here at our firm. But the renewal has to be a true renewal. And what the law says on that is that it's the amount last levied or last authorized to be levied. Okay. So I'll give you an example. If voters authorized a millage of 1 mil years ago, but has been reduced to 0.87 by the Headley rollbacks, you can only ask for renewal of 0.87 mil. You cannot ask for a renewal of 1 mil. That 0.13 mil to get you back to 1 is considered new additional millage. That's really just what the law is. And I think a lot of voters don't really understand that. I think part of this is educating voters on things they don't understand. We have, sometimes in the language we talk about Headley rollbacks. Does the average voter going into the ballot box understand what a Headley rollback is? Are they going to understand why it's new additional millage? Probably not. I mean, some of this stuff is just it can be very like in the weeds legally, but the ballot language, in my opinion, has to differentiate between the two. So what is new millage? New millage, any millage basically that's not a renewal. So if you are going to recapture the amount lost to Headley, that incremental increase is called our new millage. If you don't have any other millages, or if you're going to ask for above even what you asked for before, all of that is also new millage. I think the MTA, they have a ballot, they have some millage material that they put out, and one of the explanations they give I think is good, because I have clients that say, well, why can't we just use the word increase? It's an increase. It's not a new millage. It's just an increase. We have a millage. We're just adding to it. It's not new. It's just an increase. Well, and especially with the renewal, but if a renewal and if a millage ends and it's not renewed, your taxes get reset back to zero. So even a renewal is considered an increase under Michigan law. And that's why using the word increase isn't legally the same as a new millage. Again, we're getting into the little bit of the weeds here, but that's the explanation that I would give to you if you said, well, why do we have to use new additional? I would say, well, that's what the statute says. Why can't we just use increase? Because a renewal is technically an increase, because if it's not renewed, it gets reset to zero. And so that's technically why that's true. This is my favorite part of Millage's presentations after 2027, because they still have to spend a lot of time on this part. So the ballot language must have to fully disclose each local unit of government which revenue from that millage will be dispersed. Local unit of government means city, village, township, school district, intermediate school district, public library, or local authority created under the state. And it does include DDAs, LDFAs. One of the recommendations too is, just as an aside, if you're a township library, if you are a city library, and some of this is, we talk about purpose. So this is where I'm going to get a little bit, give you a little bit, maybe too much more information than you would want. But If you are not a district library, because the district library levies their own millage, if you are a township library, let's say, somewhere in the ballot language, we recommend that you name your specific library as the recipient of that millage, for the operations of your library. And sometimes we do like belt and suspenders at the ends. We'll say millage from this money will be dispersed to the, township library, name township library. You do want to be a little bit careful, about that too, because if you are, for example, intending to go to be a district library, maybe in the next 5 years and you have a 10-year millage, you want to make sure that you're not limiting yourself, so that money, for example, you wouldn't want to say, and this is an extreme example, that it's used for township library purposes only, or only for the township library. Because if you became a district, you wouldn't want to, again, have any argument that, you are not going to be a district. Now, if you have a 2-year millage and you have no plans to become a district in the next 2 years, we're not worried about as much as if you have a 20-year millage and you don't know what the future holds. But again, you want to be very careful. You want to make sure that, your library, people know that it's your library that's getting the money under this. So, Claire, did you?
Yeah, there's a question in the chat. So when you say last levied, what if the levy amount was actually less than the approved because the library did not need it?
That's when I say last levy, I think I would check with your lawyer, but my opinion would be is that the last maximum amount that you are authorized to levy. Is that, do you disagree
Yeah,
with that,
that's
Claire?
how I read it.
Yeah.
Yeah. But
Yeah,
that's an interesting question.
it is an interesting question. I'll have to look at the statute again because it doesn't happen. It really doesn't happen that often because most people maximize their amount of levy. But I would say that it's the last authorized amount. I don't think public policy would harm a community who voluntarily decided to levy less than that
Yeah.
by hamstringing them like that. So I'll take a look at that. But if that's your situation, if you're listening to this and that's your situation, specifically talk to your lawyer about that because I'd have to look back at the statute. But I
Then
believe.
there's one other one.
Sure.
I completely understand why the words new additional need to be in the ballot language, but are we allowed to call the millage a renewal in our marketing if we are just looking to go back to the same amount of mills that was voted on last time?
So I'm assuming okay, so I'll use whole numbers. Would the example be that let's just say the original millage was 1 mil. It's been rolled back to 0.9. And then 0.1 is new millage. Is that like a scenario? Can you call in your marketing millage the whole thing a renewal? I would not. Okay. I would call it a renewal in part, and I would use words like restoration or something like that, and run it by your lawyer to make sure that it's factually accurate. There may be a difference of opinion on this with different lawyers, but I think the statute is so specific in several places on what you can refer to as a renewal. I just don't know why then you'd be allowed to kind of globally call it a renewal. That's just my opinion. It's a very strict constructionist opinion of what the statute says.
And your marketing materials might just have to say, kind of explain it,
Yeah.
say we are refunding the library at the same amount,
Yep.
without using the word renewal.
Yes, like you can say things like this is the exact same level that you approved in 20, the level you approved, or we're restoring the, whatever your lawyer thinks the correct things are, but I wouldn't say it's a renewal of 1 mil because I think that's not accurate.
Because you will have someone push back at you, especially if you're in an area that's a little bit more tax sensitive.
I will tell you, over the years, as lawyers, we evaluate risk, right? And if using I ask Claire, I think every couple of months whether she's heard of one, whether there hasn't been a lawsuit under the Library Privacy Act ever, right?
Right.
So like, when it first was like hot and, like everything was new, we were kind of wringing our hands. And now you can say, well, this is what the law is, but the risk is, very small. I would say with campaign finance, I would actually have the opposite view. I think now the risk of someone challenging you on a campaign finance is we're seeing an uptick of this. From like no one ever bothering to now either informal complaints to the library or actually complaints filed with the state of Michigan. And so because of that, I'm just I don't think it's worth the risk of, putting that out there. Here's why too, because it might be one nuisance type of complaint, right? There are three areas of the law for public entities that I think give you like a shroud of doing something wrong. Okay. When people say that you're violating the Open Meetings Act, violating FOIA, and violating Campaign Finance Act, even if the accusations are not true, there's this shroud of, it just casts this shadow over, what do they want us to know? Like think about that when you think of, in the news a lot, when you hear of somebody filed a Campaign Finance Act violation against a candidate. I'll tell you my human nature. My human nature is not, well, that must be preposterous. Like my first, what are they trying to get away with? Right. I mean, you're kind of the human nature. You just have to like kind of think about what the average voter would think. Right. And that's why you want to be very careful to avoid, because you can put out all your press releases like, hey, we didn't do this. Hey, it's fine. Hey, we were, and we had a campaign, we've had campaign finance complaints filed against people where lawyers have reviewed the material and it turns out to be nothing in the end, but that doesn't help you when you're trying to market a campaign. It takes a couple months to get rid of these claims, and then there's the shadow of a campaign finance violation over you. That's why just a little bit of a I guess an aside as to why you want to be really careful about that. And I can take any more questions too. I'm just gonna make sure that I want to get through the next couple slides and before our time runs out. Okay, so the really good news for public libraries is there's a little bit of an asterisk if you're a city library, if you're a Section 1 city library, talk to your lawyer about this. I have my own opinion on it, but it's a little bit of an extra asterisk. But ballot language, new or renewals, and there was actually a court case on this that new renewals count under this law, but after January 1, 2017, which is any millage that's approved right now, okay, you are automatically exempt from capture from these 6 entities, okay? So, and you can only be captured by them if the library board agrees to it by a contract, okay? So what that means is, one, if they're capturing if you had an election 2 years ago, 3 years ago, and they're still capturing it, you got a problem. You should talk to your lawyer about that. But secondly, you no longer have to put on your ballot proposal. Do you remember the ones before, like, a portion of this millage may be subject to capture by, and then, DDAs, LDFAs, large library systems had like a whole paragraph of all the DDAs and LDFAs and TIFAs and stuff that captured it. So unless you have a contract that allows them to capture, and if you do have such a contract that allows them to capture, you do still have to disclose on the ballot language, okay? What are the exceptions to this? The one entity that they could not get exempted is the Brownfield Redevelopment Authority, okay? Brownfield redevelopment authorities can still capture your millage. So if you have a brownfield, and there are a number of counties that have a countywide brownfield. And so even though they might not be currently collecting within your jurisdiction, it doesn't mean that necessarily that they can't in the future. That's why you might have to still disclose. If you're a city library, contact your lawyer, because there's a little bit of some language in that about city libraries. But other than that, the good news is, one, they're not capturing your millage anymore unless you agree to it, and two, unless you don't have to put it on your ballot proposal. The reason why this was done years ago is that one of the state legislature legislator found out that this ballot proposal he had been he had voted on was being like siphoned off by all these other entities for non-related purposes. So that's why it went in there. But it was intended to ensure that voters know that certain entities will capture the millage. Voter education is very important with this because anecdotally, I'm not sure how much, maybe people are used to seeing this now because I think like 15 years ago, only a few of us were putting it on the ballot proposal. We realized it was in the law. We knew we had to do it. But again, it's my neighbor's not doing it. It's, and now I think everyone's kind of caught on. The MTA and other, put out materials that you have to put on these captures. So I think it's becoming a little bit more prevalent. And so with more familiarity, I think there's a lot less questions about it, but still education is very important. So one of the other issues is one question or two. And I will tell you that the goal is usually to have one question on the ballot. Okay. Most communities don't want to have two questions on the same ballot about their library. So the one section that you have to really know about is that MCL 211F provides that if a taxing unit that levies a millage under the Act shall not submit a single question to the electors requesting both a renewal and a new additional millage if the new additional millage is greater than 0.5 mil. This is really important, and I'll give you some examples here. Our library previously levied 1.5 mils for 20 years. That millage expires. The library currently levies 0.97 due to the Headley Amendment. If we want to ask for the restoration of 1.5, do we need two questions? Here, you cannot ask for one question for the renewal and the new millage in one question because that new millage is actually 0.53 mils. It's the new additional Headley rollback and then the new additional millage. So that would actually have to be in two questions if you wanted to ask for a renewal and a new millage. You can't have both of those in one question. So another example is the library desires to ask voters for a renewal of a previously authorized millage and ask for the lost amount due to the Headley. Here, it's that example that I just gave, a 0.9 mil, originally 1 mil, now reduced to 0.9. You can ask for the 0.9 as a renewal and the 0.1 is new additional millage because that 0.5 is less than, or the 0.1 is less than the 0.5. So how do you fix this? Okay, we'll go back to the original example of the 0.97 mils. Sometimes the client there's really two options if you want to have one question. You can ask for all of it as new millage. There's no prohibition against referring to something as a new additional millage. They just want to really be careful and they want to be really protective of the use of the term renewal. So, but you can always say it's new millage, even if part of it is a renewal. Okay, so you can always go for 1 mil, a 1.5 mils as new additional millage. The second way to do it is to ask for, I'm going to do my math on my head right here, so hopefully it's right, but ask for only 1.47 mils. So you can ask for the 0.97 mils and then ask for the maximum 0.5 mils. And instead of going all the way up to 1.5 mils, you're only going to ask for 1.47 mils. And that you can do in one question. You can ask for you can ask for 1.47 mils, of which 0.97 is a renewal of the millage that expired, and 0.5 is new additional millage. So that's the way you kind of I fix that problem. So a ballot language must be adopted by resolution of your board. So you should have a specific ballot language and resolution. I always recommend that you approve the actual ballot language. I've had so many communities that will call me up and say, oh, our board had a motion, they want 1.5 mils for 5 years. And they want me to draft the ballot proposal and then they're going to submit that to the county. I really, you have to have a resolution. The resolution should actually have the ballot proposal in there. If that's not what you want to do, I would talk to your lawyer about that. But that is really the best and I think the correct way of submitting a ballot proposal. You can only have 2 millage elections typically within 1 calendar year. Again, if you are a city library and you're subject to a charter, and you're not under the statutes, make sure that this still applies to you. There's some statutes I know of different types of authorities that can only have one a year. So you just want to be very careful if your millage fails in August that you know you can go back in December, because that might actually play a role in whether you ask for a more conservative amount of the millage or not. So again, check that with your county clerk.
Hey, Anne, we have one question.
Yeah.
So the question is, we are separate from the city. Are we still captured under Brownfield?
We are separate from the
So
city.
this is a city library that is largely been separated from its city. There's an agreement.
This is Rosie asking the question.
Oh, I would still, if the brownfield could capture in your jurisdiction, then yes, you have to notify the voters of the brownfield. Because the issue you have to look at is, can that authority capture your millage? Would they have the authority to capture your millage? Regardless of, the answer is yes. District libraries, I think, really have a problem because sometimes it's a city brownfield and township voters are like, why is my millage, my district I don't live in the city, why is it being captured? It's because your district encompasses a piece of property that could, be subject to a brownfield TIF. So that's the question that you have to ask. Can the brownfield capture part of your tax? And if the answer is yes, you have to disclose it.
I want to put an extra bit in for the idea of putting your millage language in your resolution. Not just because, of course, what Anne said, but also it is sometimes very difficult to find millage language, past millage language. Different counties keep varying years of ballots. So it can be, so if if it's in a resolution, it can be a little bit easier to find later if you need a copy of it.
Yeah, and I ask clients, I'm like, send me your old ballot proposal, and I want to see the filled in certified copy with the ballot language attached to know that that was the one that was last levied. So ballots, again, very important. The ballot deadline for this August is 4 o'clock on May 12th. Make sure that you understand the dates. And there's another date that's floated around that's basically usually 2 weeks earlier than that date. I think it's April 28th or something this year. That's the petition deadline. That typically is not the right deadline because that is a very limited use. For example, if you're going to form a new PA 164 library, you have to submit a petition, and then that petition leads to a ballot proposal being on the ballot. That's the petition deadline. The petition deadline is not the resolution deadline for a district library. But again, we've had county clerks and we've had local officials that go like toe to toe with us on this issue. Sometimes it's not worth it, right? If your board meeting is April 25th, just get it done then, and then you don't have to worry about it. But again, making sure that everyone's on the same page, I think, is a really important thing. Actual language should be approved by resolution of the library board. The District Library Establishment Act was amended to, I think, add something with district or school that you have to send it to the school district election coordinator. Claire, is it pretty much all the school district election coordinators, the county clerk? I mean, but in our resolutions, we say you're going to certify this to the school district election election coordinator. That's only if you are a district library that has a school district as a participating municipality. Again, some of the stuff is just check the box. It usually all goes to the local officials, to the county clerk anyway, but you want to make sure you check the box for district library purposes. If you're a district library with a school district as a participating municipality. I'm going to spend a couple of minutes talking about marketing the millage. I say this as a person who, I have another lawyer that I work with, Laura Genovich, if any of you worked with her. Laura reviews our millage materials to make sure they're consistent with the Campaign Finance Act. please do that. I know nobody likes spending money on lawyers. I get that. I understand that. But it's a lot easier to spend the small amount of time doing that than dealing with the campaign finance charge, because then you're going to have to hire a lawyer to defend you with the state and all that. Secondly, the there are times where libraries have hired third-party organizations to put these beautiful millage proposals together. Okay, marketing people and lawyers sometimes clash because they're trying to, their objective is to make it look good and get the millage passed. My objective is different from their objective, and because of that, especially if you're spending a lot of money on somebody or spending money on a third party, make sure that I'm not trying to disparage anyone, but I'm not necessarily thinking that everybody understands the ins and outs of campaign finance. So just because you've hired someone who's done millage campaigns before, they might not understand the Michigan Campaign Finance Act. So it does not hurt to have even those professional stuff reviewed by a lawyer. Do not give patron lists out to even a campaign finance, even your vote yes people. That's a different organization. We'll get to that in a minute. You want to be careful about Library Privacy Act, and you want to be careful about the money. So Section 57, I know you've covered this in a couple other presentations, so I'll keep it just to the legal part of it. Section 57 of the Michigan Campaign Finance Act prevents using public funds for local ballot measures, but allows the protection and dissemination of factual information concerning issues relevant to the function of a public body. It must be factual, not promotional, persuasive, or aspirational. A violation is a misdemeanor. Okay, so you want to be careful about this. So what does this mean? And I've had to have some very kind of heartbreakingly awkward conversations, and I'll give you an example. We reviewed some millage materials that produced by library that says we have the best staff in the state. Okay, now I love the library. I love your staff, right? Like you guys are great, but that's actually more of a opinion or aspirational. Now, if you've won the Library of Michigan Best Staff Award or the Michigan Library Association's Staff of the Year Award or something like that, let's say, you can say that. It's a factual. It's got some support. So anything really that can be backed by specific facts can be in your ballot proposal. And clients have said, well, another example is if you don't pass this, we're going to have to close. Well, has your board voted to close if you haven't passed it yet? Or is that just, it can look more like persuasive than factual. So again, have your marketing material reviewed by a lawyer. Those are the questions that the lawyer should ask, like what's the basis for this? Circulation, all of that stuff, the ballot language itself, the calculator of how much it will raise in 1 year and what will that mean to the average homeowner in your community. Anything that can be backed up by a fact or statistic, usually fair game. Anything else, I would really talk to your lawyer about it. Sometimes it's just changing a word in the sentence or changing something that makes it less persuasive and more factual. Ballot question committees. Claire, have you guys gone over ballot question committees quite a bit?
Not yet. That's actually next week.
Okay, I'm going to give you a little primer. Okay, ballot question committees can do lots of different things, but they are a separate organization from the library. So what we're talking about here is just what you can do with public funds, and I'll let the next week's speakers tell you what you need to do and what triggers the ballot question committee and all of that. But here we're just talking about Michigan Campaign Finance Act, so be very careful. One of the things I do want to caution, and this is one of those things that it really kind of, I don't want to say I lose sleep at night, but it makes me kind of worry for the library, is public as your public employees, because be very careful when you're asking your director to help the ballot question committee, because when the director's on the clock, that can be viewed as a use of campaign funds. So Be very careful about that. Public employees without policymaking authority are prohibited from expressing views on behalf of a public body. This can be kind of tactical too, because, libraries ask me, well, we have millage material. Can we put that millage material in the library? Okay. Yeah, if it doesn't violate the Campaign Finance Act, yes, you can put it in the library. But be careful, because then if someone picks up that material and starts interacting with your staff about that and things that maybe go beyond the factual stuff, that's where again where you might have a campaign finance. So there's some stuff that might be okay in a vacuum, but you have to really be careful about the unintended consequences. Um, um, so just you really use caution. Because public bodies are prohibited from using funds, typically anything lawn sign, anything vote yes. I would talk to your lawyer about the risks of lawn signs that say vote, or, like messages about the library, that, that's before you spend the money on lawn signs, make sure that message is vetted by someone who understands Campaign Finance Act, because that's where I think you're going to get in the most trouble, because people are going to drive, some of the material people might only get if they're a patron of the library or if they're a user of the library, but everyone's going to be driving past those lawn signs. So especially the lawn signs, be very careful before they're purchased about what can go on that lawn sign. Um, the other commonly asked question is that, well, what if somebody donates $500 to the library to use for lawn signs? Then it's not public money. Well, it is public money. If it's donated money, certainly tax dollars can't, but gifts and donations, once they go into the coffers of the library, are public money. So you can't just say, oh, well, our neighbor gave us $500 to make a lawn sign, so that doesn't count. It still does. So again, be very, very careful. Under the Campaign Finance Act, you can use a facility promoting election if any other candidate or committee has equal opportunity. The rule of thumb is don't let the vote yes committee do anything in your library that you wouldn't let the vote no committee do. So don't let the vote yes committee meet daily in your meeting room if the vote no committee has to stick to your meeting room schedule, which means you're limited to twice a month. That's going to be a problem under campaign finance. Similarly, don't give them access to your nonprofit postage meter, or or the library's copier that the public doesn't get to use, that only the staff get to use. Like all that stuff, if you don't let the vote no committee do it, and don't break the rules for the vote yes. So, I don't think it's also a really good fix if you let the vote yes use the copier and then get caught, and let the vote no use the copier. I think it's using the copier that's the problem. So just be very careful about that. Make sure that the vote yes understands, you can say, look, I know this might be awkward. You're trying to help us out. It's a weird thing, but we have to be very careful. So some of your requests we might have to politely decline, because we can't spend public money in that manner.
Anne, we have one question since we're running a little bit low on time. I just want to make sure this one gets answered.
This is my last slide. So
okay.
Questions.
Awesome.
For timing.
We are a section PA 164, Section 1 City Library. We have 3 contracted townships and, of course, the city. We are looking into having the townships levy their own millage. Do the townships submit the ballot language? What is our role in that? We already have 1 mill through the city already. Maybe be a district.
Yeah, if you don't want to be a district, but the townships, I mean, you can work with the townships, like we often draft, frankly, sometimes the library will draft the ballot proposal for the township to do, because we want to make sure we want to basically give it to them on a nice little platter. So you can do those types of things, but ultimately it's going to be the township board, for example, that'll have to approve it. Mm-hmm. And the reason why you would want to have some part in the drafting is you want to make sure that that the money, that the ballot language is drafted in such a way that it's clear that the money is going to go to you as the library, instead of just saying for library services, because you want to make sure that they understand that the library is eventually going to get the money.
I've had this question a lot, actually, where lately there are several contracted municipalities or outside municipalities that are willing to do a millage or they want the library to do it all. And I'm like, no,
Mhm.
it's not up to the library.
Yep. And it's not a library millage, it's a
Right,
township millage. Yes.
right. Yeah.
Um, and a lot of it is that libraries have really, I think a lot of libraries have said like we're not just going to do penal fine contracts anymore. So either
Thank
you
goodness.
yes, you
Yeah.
cough up your general fund
Yep.
money or you go for a millage. So
We,
I see this as come, but the problem is like, there's communities that have, then it's up to them, right? Unless you have a contract that says, you
yes.
know, so otherwise, you might like I have communities that are going like if you have three different communities that do this, then one of them might say, well, we'll do a 2-year millage, and one might say, you're constantly like, that's the only downside. I mean, if they're willing to put it on and it supports the contract and you think it's fair, I mean, that's way better than penal fines. I'm not gonna.
Yes, we've been on here at LM. We've been on a soapbox about not having penal fine only contracts, but that's another presentation.
Yeah, yeah.
Uh, Um,
But Claire's absolutely right. I mean, obviously, district-wide millage is it's your control. You can have the millage, you're not leaving it to the discretion. I'm gonna stop sharing my screen here. So you're not leaving it up to the discretion of anybody else. I mean, that's sort of optimum, but yes, if you can't do that, then it will be the townships that have to put that ballot proposal on.
so there's another question in the chat. Can friends of the library use their funds to do a promotional mailing to promote millage support?
Say that.
Can friends of the library use their funds to do a promotional mailing to promote millage support?
Okay, a couple things. One, I'm going to speak generally because when I represent the library, libraries often ask me this, and I'm like, I can't give legal advice to what the Friends can do because the Friends are typically one, they're either a Michigan nonprofit, hopefully, if they're not, they're a loose group of people, or they've got a federal um, they've got a federal tax exemption. And so I don't like to give advice as to what they can give because that I don't want it to affect their tax exemption. Okay. So there's that issue. But the other issue is that um, then they're going to give it to probably a ballot question committee because they can donate. Friends could probably donate money to the library, as like, they could sponsor a program. They could do it for promotion for your mailing, but if it's like the other, it's where it gets into a little bit complicated is if they want to give the money then to like a ballot question committee, because that's where you got to be really kind of careful about the tax implications of that.
Um, do you suggest being on the August ballot or November for new millage since we are requesting to go from a 1 mil to a 1.25? And this is coming from Rosie.
I don't, I typically can't really answer that question because it's very community based and it's sometimes people want to be with the November election, they want to be with the larger election. A lot of communities want to be in the summer because not, only people aren't going out of their way when it's nice out to vote down a library millage, but it's really kind of outside the legal parameters. The only legal issue is to make sure that if you went in November, that your community can still levy that December if you're going for a December millage.
Okay, so we are at 3:31. Thank
Woo!
you. Thank you, Anne, so
Yes.
much. We so appreciate you as always. So thank you, everybody, again. Thank you so much, Anne.
Great questions,
We're
everybody.
so
Thank you.
grateful.
Appreciate it.
Yeah. And good luck on your millages.
Yes. All right. Thanks. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.